1, 2, 3.
Hi there! It's Chromebook time!
Perfect. Need, the new religion. Unmask today's secular morality. By Tony Walker. Exposing the language of need. Published in 1985 by InterVarsity Press. InterVarsity Press, a division of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Preface. Laments about materialism are rife, denouncing our need for material things, but belief that certain things are necessary and indispensable is much more widespread than even most ardent lamenters of materialism suppose. Many men, for example, seem to need paid employment in order to be men, and increasingly women are coming to feel a similar need. Many women need to bear a child in order to be a complete woman. Many people on both sexes think that life will be less than complete without a mate. It is fashionable to follow the views of some psychologists that the self is a bundle of needs, and that personal growth is the business of progressively meeting those needs. Many Christians go along with such beliefs. But is this just tagging along with the spirit of the age? The Christian faith is founded on a man whom Christians believe to be the most complete person this world has ever known. By present standards, this man was poor in material things. He was not married, had no children, and gave up his job in order to become an itinerant and unpaid preacher. The totalitarian Roman Empire in which he lived denied him many of those things which today are regarded as basic human needs. Moreover, Jesus taught that, far from basing our lives on needs of the self, we should take up our cross and deny ourselves. Yet nobody, least of all those who knew him, has ever called Jesus an ascetic. Some of them even criticized him for enjoying life. This picture of Jesus suggests that work, parenthood, marriage, sex, human company, material goods, and all the good things of life are precisely that, the good things of life. But we do not need them in order to become complete persons, to be a human. They can never become the basis of a fulfilled existence. They are literally goods, not commodities, but things good in themselves. In a world richly endowed by God, there are too many good things for us to be dependent on any one for a full life. This is in complete contrast to what most people believe today. They say, well, if people didn't need to work, then nobody would work. If people didn't need company, then they become hermits. The only basis for work or any human activity that they can conceive of is need. Marriage is seen as a contract in which I meet your needs in return for your meeting my needs. Quote, I love you, end quote, now means, quote, I need you, end quote. Child rearing and education are fashionably seen as a matter of meeting children's needs rather than teaching them knowledge or values. Even holidays and sports are seen as meeting leisure needs and recreational needs created by the pressures and unhealthiness of factory, office, or kitchen. Is this really the free, fun-loving society we suppose ours to be? So many of the things that Jesus saw as goods, people today can conceive only as meaning of a need and escape from a bad. What alternative is there? While pointing sadly to the fact that people do indeed act out of weakness and need, the biblical writers, along with other sages through human history, held a vision of an alternative way of life. Not struggling through work, marriage, or a program of self-actualization to create a self out of nothing, but responding to the pre-existing love and grace found both in God and in the groups to which we all belong. This involves rejecting the achievement-oriented individualism of our time and rediscovering the freedom found in community. And there are many implications for personal living, for welfare arrangements, and for society. Liberation theology has so far focused on how those in the third world can liberate themselves from this visible oppression. It has failed to show how Christianity promises freedom in modern Western societies because it has not understood the nature of oppression in such societies, which is often internal as much as external. It is the voice of the new inner needs, not the whip of the plantation owner, that enslaves us. People believe that affluence enables them to graduate from consumption of necessities to consumption of luxuries. That history is now liberating them from the necessities of work to the freedom of leisure. That personal growth involves a graduation from basic needs, security, love, etc., to free self-fulfillment. But these are all lies. The evidence consistently shows new needs to be created by these very processes of affluence, personal growth, and history. This is peculiarly modern prison for which if we really mean business by liberation, we must find a key. Part 1 documents need in selected areas. Part 2 reviews and assesses this. If there is one chapter which contains the nub of the book, then it is chapter 10. Needs must. The reader, whose approach to books is one of dipping rather than plowing, should ensure he does not miss that chapter. As it is not the easiest chapter, however, it should perhaps not be the first dipped. Introduction. 1. A new morality. A new morality is all about us, and virtually nobody has noticed. Its centerpiece is need. Needs are good things, and meeting need is the ultimate good. Of course, everybody knows that morals are changing. There may be some dispute as to how much people's behavior is changing, but there is no disagreement that the grounds of moral appeal are changing. How may I justify my behavior to myself and to others? What were once acceptable as good reasons, such as God says, the Bible says, the church says, my parents always taught me so, I ought, you have a duty to, are rarely heard today and sound old-fashioned. What reasons are supposed to be acceptable today? Humanism and democracy both evaluate the reason and the will of how individual I choose, I want, and I have decided are now perfectly respectable justifications for behavior, with the sole proviso that my choice does not harm others. This is the new morality, which so shocked traditionalists in the 1960s. Many who are unhappy with current moral changes would concur that there is more choice available today. They complain that youngsters especially have far too much freedom to do as they please nowadays. They may disagree with humanists as to the desirability of personal freedom to do as one pleases, but they agree that "I want" is becoming a popular motive. Some religious language, too, reflects the change and makes central the ideal individual's choice. Whereas once the new convert saw himself as responding to the moral demands of God, now he sees himself as having made a personal decision to follow Christ. "Thou shalt" is replaced by "I choose." Some philosophers in the last century considered human happiness to be our main purpose in life. If something made people happy, then it was, by definition, a good thing. Maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain were deemed good motives. And it would seem that they may have succeeded in replacing traditional morality by the language of happiness and pleasure, if one is to believe those vociferous guardians of the old order, from Malcolm Muggeridge in Britain to the moral majority in the States. We castigate our age for its hedonism. Personal pleasure and fun are what people live for now, they complain. Certainly, "it's fun" is a justification that is hard to argue against. The opinion of most commentators on modern life is that the traditional moral language of "I ought" has been replaced by the language of "I want," "I choose," and "it's fun." Each person is now out for himself. That's what the pundits think. But are they right? If you actually listen to the language of people in everyday life, and this includes the language of the pundits themselves when they are not pontificating on what motivates others, you will hear remarkably little about choices, pleasure, and wants. Actions which are manifestly not prescribed by biology or society, and which are the choice of the individual, are talked of more often than not as necessities rather than choices. We are more likely to hear "the car needs washing" than "I've decided to wash the car." The television advertisement is likely to say "you need them," as "next time, why not choose them?" I have no idea what "them" is. This was written in Britain. Probably the housewife has more scope to organize her working day and the nature of her task than most other workers. Yet housework, which she has devised to meet the standards of cleanliness she has decided on, are experienced as one must after another. The dishes need doing. Jim's trousers need mending. I must get the washing out before it rains. This occupation involves more people than any other. It provides vast scope for personal organization of the work by the worker, and yet the language of choice is hardly ever heard. It seems as though the houseworker imprisons herself by continually experiencing personally decided upon courses of action as necessities. If anything is motivated by free will, surely it is love. Love that is not freely given is not love. Yet even in love and marriage, the language of need is taking over. "I love you, darling," has become "I need you, baby." Marriage today is not the mutual giving of self, but the mutual meeting of each partner's need by the other. If one partner's needs are no longer being met by the other, then this is widely deemed as grounds for divorce. "I could no longer meet her needs. She can no longer meet my needs," is the cry of the partner who walks out. And this is accepted in many circles. It is not a matter of choice, but of necessity. That other major form of love, charity, is also reconceived in terms of needs. Personal philanthropy that reached out to the sick and suffering has been replaced by bureaucratized welfare in which the person is conceived as a bundle of needs. The system splits this bundle into several parts and allocates each of the particular profession, medicine, social work, and whatever, that in the business to meet that need. Charity, the total giving of one person to the totality of another, is out of fashion. It is hardly possible in a welfare system dominated by bureaucracy and professionalism. Even holidays and vacations, though they clearly have little other purpose, are rarely justified in terms of pleasure and fun. I, or you, need a break, we say. Many people frown on taking a vacation until they need it. Planners, politicians, and social scientists talk of the recreational needs of the masses. The popular press, magistrates, and social workers frown with disapproval when some youngster, out for a good time on a Saturday night, which gets him into trouble of some kind, simply says in his defense, "It was fun," or "I did it for kicks." If we are such a fun-loving, hedonistic society of self-determining individuals, why do we hear so little of pleasure and choice in everyday talk? Why so much appeal to need and necessity? Most of us, most of the time, do not experience ourselves as masters of our own destiny, freely choosing our own pleasures. No, we feel ourselves to be slaves to necessity. The best reason that I can give for an action is that I or you need it. This is the new morality. This is the new language that tells you and me whether or not I am doing what I'm doing is right. There is a popular misconception, especially among those who read too much philosophy and listen too little to their next-door neighbors or even to themselves, that science demonstrates how all our actions are pre-programmed or determined by biology, genes, environment, upbringing, and so on, and that the sense of free will and of being able to choose is an illusion. I suspect the evidence points to precisely the opposite. Science shows us how unprogrammed human beings are compared to other species. Most species are largely governed by instinct and have no choice. The vast majority of human behavior, however, is learned, which means that we learn how to act by adopting the cultural rules of our particular society. And there is no evidence that the diversity of human cultures is programmed in detail by biology. My genes do not tell me to use a knife and fork any more than the Chinamans tell him to use chopsticks. But while we actually are free, we feel we have no choice. I need my knife and fork. I need my laundry powder. I need the knowledge that most of humanity has gotten along without laundry powder and knives and forks, but they in no way reduces my need. In precisely those areas where biology leaves us free, society steps in and takes away that freedom. Natural science shows us how to be remarkably free. It is in everyday life that we imprison ourselves by creating needs for ourselves. We put ourselves in need. To say we are slaves to necessity, however, does not capture the whole of people's experience of themselves as in need, for on the whole, we actually welcome our needs. Everyone agrees it is good that we should have needs, and even better that those needs should be met. And it is this that makes the contemporary language of need a moral language. People today assume that needs are not bad things to be eliminated, but good things to be met. The pop singer croning, "I need you, baby," is positively rejoicing in his state of need. More seriously, we spend our lives exploring this rich world not joyfully, but out of weakness, to solve some inner need. We get married because we cannot bear the prospect of life alone. We have children in response to what we conceive as maternal or paternal need. We go to the countryside because we need fresh air and a dose of wild nature. Our work is dominated by psychological needs for security and recognition. All of this is seen as a good thing. A society in which people are not motivated by need simply would not be possible, we think. For people would not have children if they didn't need to, and so on. Needs are conceived as of good things without which society could not operate. This view is thoroughly ingrained in psychiatry, psychology, sociology, and economics. We actually want to be in need. This has not always been so. In the Stoic and Christian traditions, for example, a person's needs and desires were often believed to be at war with the moral demands of God or the good of society. More recently, Sigmund Freud believed that there are fundamental conflicts between the biological needs and desires of the unconscious id and the conscience of the superego, between self and society, between I need and I ought, conflicts that are resolved by I will of the ego. But Freud's psychology is replaced now in the popular bookstores and on many psychiatrists' couches by the humanistic psychology of writers such as Fromm, Maslow, and Rogers, whose ideal personality is one in which the needs of the individual can be, should be, or are met by society. The personality is a bundle of needs. Life's project is the progressive meeting of them. The society is the midwife of this gradual emergence of the self-actualized person. One mark of the almost total success of this new morality is that of the Christian church, traditionally keen on mortifying the desires of the flesh, on crucifying the needs of the self in pursuit of the religious life, has eagerly adopted the language of needs for itself. To the long queues of doctors, salesmen, advertisers, and pop song lovers peddling their wares with the slogan that they will meet our needs, we now hear that Jesus will meet your every need, as though he has some kind of divine psychiatrist or divine detergent, as though God were there simply to serve us. Enthusiastic young Christians hopefully implore God to meet their various wants and needs, whereas the medieval ascetic would have prayed for strength to deny his needs. Then, when some of his needs are not met by Jesus, as the medievals knew full well they would not be, the modern convert is liable to abandon his faith with as much just cause for complaint as the person who leaves his marriage partner for the same reason, that the expectation of total need satisfaction has not been fulfilled. Likewise, social gospel churches see their job as meeting the needs of the local community as though God were some kind of ultimate welfare agency. Is this new escalation of needs just a new way of talking about our wants? Do we say, I need, when we know perfectly well what we really mean is, I want? Is it just a linguistic cover-up for rampant hedonism? Well, sometimes people do say, I need, in this way, but by no means always. Need is far more subtle and consequently more powerful than that. Often wants and needs are directly in conflict. The hospital patient who says, I feel better now, doctor, I want to go home, may be confronted with the reply, you're still very sick, you need to stay here. Possibly the main issue in the philosophy of welfare today is whether services should be provided to meet the conscious wants of clients, the consumer model of welfare, or to meet the client's needs as determined authoritatively by the professional worker, the paternalist model of welfare. Inherent in this practice of social work is the distinction between the presenting problem, what the client says he wants, what he says is his problem, and what the social worker assesses is the real underlying need. My "I want" is likely to be overridden, rightly or wrongly, by some professional saying, "Maybe, but you need something else." Certainly all children quickly learn that what they want is often overridden by what their parents say they need. Also, if "I need" means no more than "I want," then people would not experience what they call needs as needs. Also, if "I need" means no more than "I want," then people would not experience what they call needs as needs. They would know that it's just a way of talking. Sometimes it is. But when a housewife goes to the supermarket saying she needs some more laundry powder, she really means she needs it, not just wants it, and won't be able to do the washing without it. When an unemployed woman says she needs a job, she means it. When a man says he needs his wife and would be lost without her, he doesn't just mean he loves her, likes her, or desires her, but that he really does need her. Excuse me. Need really is what motivates people much of the time. Of course, there are many times when it is also used as a convenient rationalization after the event, covering up a whole range of other motives. But that is typical of any morality. Any morality both deeply motivates people and provides convenient rationalizations. Duty to family or country, for example, have in the past been the wellspring of many actions, and at the same time have provided a convenient excuse for not considering the effects of one's actions on others less closely related than family or fellow countrymen. It is precisely because a moral code provides a general language for talking about behavior that, in any society, rationalizations are usually given in the language of the dominant moral code. Any other language would be less credible. So my argument that need has become a new moral language does not hinge on whether or not or how often people use this language with less than total conviction. The language of the Ten Commandments did not have a motive even 1/10 of the actions of middle-class Victorian society for it to be the moral language of that society. In fact, if people do say need when they meant want, this is very strong evidence for my argument. Excuse me. If our society really values choice and freedom and pleasure, why don't people say "I want" when they mean "I want"? Why is it more respectable, easier, more persuasive to say "I need"? Surely because need is known to be accepted as a more legitimate motive, a morally better motive. Needs and progress. Needs and talk of needs are certainly proliferating. The catalog of my local library lists books by the score with "need" in the title. Modern needs, the needs of adolescents, the needs of ex-prisoners, the training needs of new foremen, the long-term irrigation needs of England and Wales, basic human needs, common human needs, special educational needs, the needs of children, the needs of industry, sexual needs, emotional needs, housing needs, family needs, community needs, organizational necessities, and individual needs, manpower needs, energy needs, the needs of single people, the needs of homeless people, research needs, social needs. And that's only a start. The list seems endless. Virtually every aspect of human existence is now talked of as a need. Many, if not most, of these needs are new. Certainly, talking of them as needs is new. A person's need for paid employment certainly did not exist in the largely non-money economies of medieval villages or tribal societies. The need for laundry powder is rather new. Many of the emotional needs which spouses meet in each other may have been created by the pressures of our consumerist, industrial, urban society. Is this proliferation of needs a good thing? Clearly, the manufacturers of the goods that meet the new needs think so. Also, psychologists think it a mark of personal progress that the individual can advance from being concerned about basic needs like food and security to more advanced emotional needs. And even Karl Marx thought that to be a man of few needs was the mark of a primitive, and he looked forward to a society and to a personality rich in needs. All these believers in human progress believe the history of civilization to be more the progressive meaning of our simpler needs, so allowing more complex and rewarding needs to emerge. Creating and meeting need is what makes the world go round. Marx and Engels spoke of them all when they said that, quote, the satisfaction of the first need leads to new needs, and this production of new needs is the first historical act, end quote. Never did the 19th century voice of progress speak more clearly. An alternative interpretation of the proliferation of needs finds it a strange kind of progress that can conceive of the richness of human life only as a series of necessities, and that rewrites history to say that this has ever been so. Factually, it is hardly correct to say that people have always been preoccupied with their needs. There is widespread evidence that unsophisticated tribes are usually very concerned with religion and ritual, with community and family life. For these are what enabled them to make sense of what appear to us as prior states of need, such as hunger and sickness. The biblical writers believed that creation was richly endowed by God, that life was full of blessings, good, health, fertility, national security, which were to be enjoyed and appreciated when available, but which did not destroy the meaning of life when removed, though people have always found this hard to accept, as many of the more despairing Psalms demonstrate. These writers portrayed the good things of life as blessings, not needs. Not, as the dictionary puts it, things which one cannot well do without. The focus was on the giver, not the receiver. When human beings believe themselves to be self-sufficient, however, as has become fashionable over the last couple of hundred years, the human needs take center stage. Alone in the universe, what else could we put at the center? I sometimes feel that perhaps we cannot actually cope with the very real choices and freedoms offered by modern society and by its human beings as autonomous, that we cannot bear the personal responsibility of choosing. And so we welcome the creation of new needs, material or psychological, by which our lives can be directed. With nothing outside of ourselves to live for which could direct our choices, we make our needs the focus of our lives, and this results in the negation of choice. We experience manifestly good things, such as creativity in our work or the joy of romantic love, and elevate them into idols which we cannot do without. Every political party, religion, or social movement today offers liberation. They usually offer liberation from external constraints. Socialism and feminism have a vision in which people are no longer dominated economically or politically by others. Liberation theology constantly refers to South America, where the domination of the poor is particularly concrete and visible. One reason, perhaps, that socialism fails to gain much support among the better off members of the better off nations is that such people have had many of their obvious shackles removed. The proletariat of the 19th century has been replaced by the affluent working class of the mid-20th century, and the labor movement struggles to find supporters. The old appeal to workers to throw off their shackles makes less sense when the shackles are no longer very obvious. Liberation theology may look fine in South America or to North American blacks, but white Christians in Western Europe and North America have considerable difficulty in applying it in their own lives. One response is to show how we have internalized many of our constraints. The women's movement, for example, shows not only how women are barred by male-dominated system from economic and political equality, but also how women limit themselves by their belief in the inevitability of this state of affairs. The constraints are as much internal as external. And this is how the women's movement appeals to those women in the professions and business who have gained formal equality with men. This too was part of the appeal of Herbert Marcuse, I believe, to an affluent young generation in the late 1960s, where he showed how society limits us by getting us to limit ourselves. So far, so good. But many liberationists overestimate the ease with which these internal shackles can be thrown off. Some assume people to be dupes of a capitalist male white plot, or at least of the capitalist male white system, and as people are rational, they will fight to change this once they have become aware of the situation. Education and the raising of awareness is the answer they propose. But what I want to show is to how we are willing dupes. We really do welcome the needs which imprison us, and we embrace them for ourselves. There are very good reasons for us giving this welcome, which we will not be thrown lightly aside by education or consciousness rising. And indeed, it is noticeable that the educators and consciousness raisers have debunked one set of needs, simply replaced them with yet more needs, and their disciples embrace the new needs with yet more enthusiasm than the old. We cannot blame somebody else, for we are each our own jailer. We cannot blame someone else, for we are each our own jailer. 2. The history of need. If needs have not always occupied a central place in human awareness, how have they been thought of in the past, and when did they come to be central? This is a vast subject, and I can do no more here than briefly sketch a very few lines of a complicated picture. My aim in this chapter is to show, firstly, that our own country's views of needs is far more inevitable, and secondly, to sketch the historical context in which our own lives, including my own, have developed. Antiquity. If the 20th century view is that the purpose of society is to meet human needs, then the view of some of the ancient Greeks was exactly opposite. Basic needs were met by non-members of society, namely slaves and women, who were despised because of this involvement in a life of necessity. They grew and cooked the food, looked after the house, disposed of refuse, and so on. All this took place in the private household. Society was something different altogether. Society was a public arena where citizens, all male and freemen, met to discuss and argue and politic. Society was what happened after basic needs had been met. Far from being central to a fully human existence, needs were a diversion from it. The Epicureans, for example, believed in pleasure and thought that the proliferation of needs produced only a small increase in pleasure at the cost of a large increase in pain. Best, therefore, to limit needs. The Stoics believed it wise to concentrate on those few things over which they have control. The more needs you have, the more things affect you that you cannot control. And so for this reason, it is best to limit your needs. And Faverinus, one of the cynics, noted that, quote, great needs spring from great wealth. And often the best way of getting what we want is to get rid of what we have, end quote. Such philosophies doubtless held some truth for the minorities of free citizens, but they conveniently forgot that the daily lives of our over 3/4 of the people were preoccupied with meeting the needs of the privileged few. The philosophy rested on the assumption that those who spent their time meeting basic needs were not really humans at all, or certainly not citizens of society. The Hebrew view has already been alluded to. Things which we see as basic needs, food, health, life itself, were not seen as needs which people struggle to provide, but as blessings from a divine creator. Rather than striving to meet our inborn lacks and needs, there is a vision in the Old Testament of a people and a land richly endowed by God. The Lord is my shepherd, I will not lack. Psalm 23:1. Even when wandering in the wilderness, the very symbol of lack and need, God provided for the children of Israel so that they lacked nothing. Modern people in our so-called affluent society, brought up to strive to meet their own needs and lacks through economical and physiological effort, have great difficulty comprehending this old Hebrew concept of the original affluent society given by God. God's gift seems to offend modern pride in human striving. We may just be able to conceive of a God who meets our needs and lacks. Jesus is here, will meet your every need. But one who holds out a vision of life in which we never lack in the first place is almost beyond our comprehension. The Bible does recognize the existence of human lacks and needs, but considers them created not by God, but by human beings. This is explored further in chapter 10. The Christian church, particularly in the writings of St. Augustine, introduced a new theme: the war between the desires and needs of the flesh and the requirements of God. Not that this was the only view. Sometimes human bodily desires were seen as simply natural, as in some of St. Paul's writing on marriage. Marriage was necessary in order to meet the physical needs of men and women. It was therefore not to be denigrated, as the popular misunderstanding of St. Paul supposes, but neither was marriage or sexual love to be spiritualized, as some 19th century romantics would have it. He was concerned that if bodily desires did not have some legitimate outlet, they might easily take a form that would conflict with the Christian life. In other passages, Paul sees merit in subjugating bodily needs to higher purposes. He refrains from eating meat in order not to upset certain people. For he believes that the unity of the church is more important than his penchant for veal. And fasting was a characteristic throughout Christianity from Jesus himself onwards. It is important to realize that the New Testament does not counterpose the needs of the body to spiritual things. There are fallen angels as well as sinful flesh. There is as much temptation in the spiritual as in the physical. But there has been throughout Christian history, an awareness that the desires of the body and human will, on the one hand, and the requirements of God on the other, may very well be in conflict. There is nothing sacrosanct about human needs. At the same time, Christian charity has been concerned to remedy human want and misery. Christian thinking, therefore, has, at best, appreciated the ambiguity and complexity of human needs. At worst, been confused about them. It has varied from seeing physical needs as natural to seeing them as spiritual dangers, to seeing them as objects of charity. But as with the Greeks and the Hebrews, human need was never central to Christian theology. What was central was God's grace, not human need. Christianity is at root God-centered, not man-centered. The Enlightenment. Modern notions of need drew on the kind of philosophy established by Locke in the late 17th century. Whereas Descartes thought of our reason was basic to human life, I think, therefore I am, Locke thought that desire was even more basic. Before the newborn infant gets around to thinking he desires food, warmth, comfort. It is through desire that he begins to relate to the world. His first conscious experience of himself is as lacking something, as needing something. He comes to know those who nurture him as those who supply that lack. So, whereas early and medieval theology tended to see desire as spiritually dangerous, Locke and those who followed him saw it simply as basis for all human experience, whether we liked it or not. David Hume, for one, did not like it. Did like it. I'm trying to read too fast. David Hume, for one, did like it. He thought that, though our wants continually multiply, our abilities multiply still faster, so we get progressively better off. He thought need to be a good basis for morality. If you need to do X, then you should do X. Hume repudiated a religious foundation for morality and put it in its place as a foundation in human needs, interests, desires, and happiness, which he called the passions. He observed that, though we may be totally perplexed as to the meaning of life, nevertheless, most of us do get through life in meeting the needs and desires of the body and appeasing hunger, thirst, pain, sexual desire. We find justification enough for toil and activity. The passions provide a more effective morality for daily life than do torturous metaphysical or religious speculations. In the 19th century, other philosophers, such as Benham and Mill, developed these ideas which clearly meshed with the experience of the ruling class of a Britain that was expanding economically and coming to dominate the world politically. In general, it was deemed that to be progress to move from the basic natural needs to a higher, and in a sense artificial, needs. Certainly industrial Britain required ever more needs in order to expand. Some of the early socialists were not sure about this, though. They clearly distinguished basic needs, which are natural and not influence. So they thought by society, and which are the basis for human beings coming together in society, from artificial needs which were created by a technology and a rampant capitalism that had gotten out of control. This approach tended to romanticize primitive peoples. Rousseau thought that once simple natural needs are met, people begin to procure all kinds of conveniences unknown to their forefathers. So far, so good, but then these conveniences become real needs, in the sense that it is more painful to be without them than pleasant to have them. If only there remained wants, all would be well. but when they turn into needs, we store up trouble for ourselves. In particular, we are prone to exploitation by those who provide our needs. We become entangled in a complex, exploitive society. The German philosopher Hegel made some crucial connections that rendered some of our 20th century views possible. He started with the observation that, in themselves, people are not self-sufficient. They have to create their own sufficiency by struggling to meet their needs. In this struggle with the external, natural world, they become aware of themselves. Without the struggle, they would have no self-awareness. And without the needs, there would be no struggle. This is what both history and our dealings with the natural world are all about. Unlike Rousseau, who saw this need for self-estimation and for the esteem from others as creating all kinds of false needs and exploitation by others, Hegel saw it was precisely the means by which the knots of society are tied. For Hegel, society is a system of needs. The way in which needs enters into Marx's writing is quite complex and varied. Suffice it to say here that on the one hand, there is an echo of Hegel. Needs are the cement of society, and Marx's envisioned communist society, quote, to each according to his need, end quote, fulfills Hegel's vision. On the other hand, Marx draws from the early socialists the distinction between true and false needs, though for him this is not the same as the distinction between natural and artificial needs, true, false versus natural, artificial. He is aware both that the experience of even the most basic needs is influenced by the society one lives in, and that many higher cultural needs may be highly desirable. To have criteria for knowing what our true needs is essential if the slogan, quote, to each according to his need, end quote, is to mean very much. In these philosophers lies the seeds of much of the present day talk about needs. The utilitarians had a view of needs not so different from that of modern businessmen, advertisers, economists, who believe economic growth to be a healthy response to the ever-expanding needs of human beings. The primitivist Rousseau heralds those today who long to go back to the simple life not dependent on modern technology, and who dub primitive needs as natural. Hegel foreshadows those existentialists and humanists who see the development of the personality as a process of becoming. And Marx's concern for identifying our true needs was rediscovered in the 1960s by many students. The 20th century. It was not until this century, however, that these ideas, basically that the human project is the progressive meeting of our needs, came to be deeply rooted in the everyday experience of ordinary men and women. In this section, I will suggest 4 features of the modern world since 1945 that seem to me to have helped carry these ideas into everyday life and language. They are: 1, the absorption of psychological ideas into everyday experience. Repeating. 1, the absorption of psychological ideas into everyday experience. 2, the welfare state. 3, the United Nations. And 4, the consumer society. Let's look briefly at each. Psychology. Freud shared with St. Paul an understanding of the inevitable conflict between instinctual desires, the id, and the conscience, the superego. He saw both civilization and the more pathological parts of our personality as the result of the sublimation or repression of the id. The complexity and subtlety of his theory, however, is understood by few, which has been taken from Freud by millions of people, is the simplistic notion that it is bad to repress our sexual and other basic human needs. People have adopted Freud's notion that the gratification of our needs is what motivates all human behavior, but have lost sight of his understanding of how creative can be. Let me get this right so I don't mess this up. But have lost sight of his understanding of how creative can be the struggle between those needs and the conscience and the will. People have adopted Freud's notion that the gratification of our needs is what motivates all human behavior, but have lost sight of his understanding of how creative can be the struggle between those needs and the conscience and the will. It seems likely that mid-20th century culture has used Freud as much as it has been shaped by him. This is a part of Freud that fits our notion of human needs, and so he has been wheeled in to give intellectual credence to it. From all great teachers, people hear what they want to hear. The notion of need was also adopted by other psychologists for a brief period in the 1920s. They thought that basic psychological needs provided an objective starting point for psychology, a starting point on which everyone could agree and where language was unambiguous. But fairly soon, it became apparent that, especially with sexual and other more complex needs, experts were not at all agreed, and the word need was abandoned in favor of drive. Need, drive. Unlike needs, which have been believed to be real deficits residing in the individual, drives were recognized as no more than useful observable construct that psychologists can employ to help make sense of behavior they could observe. But the belief that human behavior was motivated by basic needs or drives has remained influential in psychology ever since. From the 1940s onward, this was combined with a belief in progress to produce the humanistic psychologies of Maslow, Rogers, Fromm, and others, in which the person advances from basic needs to even higher needs, a view which has been profoundly influential in the psychiatric couches of middle-class America. Need implies lack. We are born empty and incomplete. We are potential only. And life is the striving to fill up the emptiness and become more complete. Self-actualization, realizing our full potential, becomes the goal of life. The welfare state. In North America, psychology has been a major channel through which the notion of need has entered everyday life. In Britain, perhaps the introduction of the welfare state has been more influential. This has meant that meeting people's needs has displayed an altruistic rather than a self-centered flavor. Meeting your needs as well as mine. But the basic notion is the same: civilization as the progressive meeting of human need. Following the Second World War, there was a tremendous popular support for establishing and developing a tax-supported health service, schooling, Social Security, and other welfare services. We may not have been so very sure what we had been fighting for in the war, but we united under the banner of a nation that looked after the needs of its people, with religion no longer providing any national purpose, and with liberal capitalism having shown itself bankrupt in the Depression of the 1930s. What universal values were there that could direct national life? The answer was clear, and has been clear to those left of center ever since. Quote, the universal satisfaction of vital needs, and, beyond it, the progressive alleviation of toil and poverty are universal valid standards. This was said by a philosopher and is the goal of the paternalist socialism the world over. The United Nations. Something similar was happening on the international scene, though without the rhetoric of socialism. The United Nations was set up because there had to be some kind of international forum for the nation to resolve their differences before things got to the stage of another world war. But what was it that would enable nations to get together? What was it that would unite them? The answer came in the form of two related slogans: human rights and human needs. All human beings, irrespective of nationality or politics, it was proposed, had certain rights that had to be safeguarded and certain basic needs that had to be met if they were able to be led fully, if they were to be able to lead fully human lives. Many of the United Nations subsidiary organizations are devoted to those groups most in danger of their rights and needs not being met, like children, UNICEF, UNESCO, and the sick, WHO, and the hungry, FAO. Making sure that everyone's needs for health services, education, employment, food, and so on are met in this goal that unites member states of very different political persuasions, or that at least is the hope. That at least is the hope. The problem in a century marked by the Gulag and the Holocaust was how to find a common and universally acceptable basis of human dignity. On what could human rights rest? Clearly, religious beliefs were of no avail. For the member states of the United Nations were of many religions and of none. But they did all pay lip service to science. And so it seemed fruitful to try to base human dignity on facts rather than on values. Facts are universal. Values manifestly are not. And what fact about human existence is most obvious? Or obvious to at least to post-Lockean, post-Enlightenment humankind? The fact that we are all born with needs. Needs which must be met if we are now to know anything like a decent life. Needs which must be met if we are to have any chance of fulfilling our potential. An undernourished peasant child will never grow to be a worker able to contribute properly to a society. A child who is not loved will be emotionally handicapped for life. So the meeting of human needs becomes the basis without which human dignity was hardly possible. It seemed that human rights could be based on an objective fact, and a vast army of scientists and social scientists was commissioned by WHO and UNESCO, UNESCO, and the rest of the establishment with greater and greater precision the needs of human beings on how to meet them. Human dignity and ultimately world peace had been reduced to a technical problem. The consumer society. The programs for meeting human need pioneered by psychologists, social politicians, and international organizations provide a good reason for the vast expansion of welfare bureaucracies and welfare professions, doctors, teachers, social workers, and so on. But big business was not averse to such programs either. They welcomed anything that brought the poor into the markets for education, health, and basic consumer durables that had previously been preserved for the middle-class minority, for it became apparent that capitalism's future depended on everyone, not just a wealthy minority, becoming consumers. Advertisements quickly adopted the new language of need. If scientists are agreed that need is what drives your life and mine, then clearly anyone with something to sell had to demonstrate that people needed it. So it was that every product became a need. In the radical 60s, criticism of the consumer society revived the old 19th century socialist concern with distinguishing true from false needs. The consumer society generated lots of false needs. Indeed, it depended on generating them in order continually to expand. Critics of the consumer society set themselves to task of somehow working out with where people's real needs were. To do this, they required some understanding of human nature and human fulfillment. And so they turned to various Freudian and humanistic psychologies of the self-actualization variety, thus linking the old European socialist tradition of to each according to his need with the American preoccupation with psychiatry. Several new left gurus like Marcuse and Fromm, living in the United States, they succeeded in articulating dissatisfaction with consumerism, but at the cost of alluding to yet more psychological needs, which big business was heartily slow capitalizing on, which perhaps demonstrates the power not only of the consumer society, but also of the apparent need for needs. The need for needs. At the heart of the consumer society is the language of need. This language is so deeply rooted that even consumerism's most strident critics have used the language of need in their attack on consumerism. I doubt whether such attacks can work in the long run, because the language of need is as much the problem as it is the consumer society. The New Left's revival of a vision of a society that meets our true needs was a reaction not only to post-war consumer society, but also to the belief that of social scientists in the 1950s that their academic studies should be value-free, objective, and scientific. Value-free. They felt their work as social scientists to be in the realm of facts, of what is the case, and that this had to be separated from their role as responsible citizens, where they were not allowed to use the language of what ought to be. While there was no logical reason why this separation of is and ought statements should be inhibited moral or ethic declarations of value in the appropriate places, in practices it did. Radical social scientists who passionately did want to make statements of value latched onto the concept of need as the way through this impasse, for a need is both a scientifically demonstrated fact and it carries imperative force. This is what radical social scientists like C. Wright Mills and Herbert Marcuse had in common with the average bureaucrat or research scientist in the United Nations. But we no longer live in the heady days of the radical 60s, when a buoyant economy could support buoyant critics. The early 1980s has seen the biggest worldwide depression since the 1930s, and it has become as easy to see through the extravagance of the psychological needs proclaimed by the West Coast psychotherapists as it is for the unemployed to see the obscurity and obscenity of consumer needs from which they have excluded the lack of funds. If you have learned to do without a car and to forego redecorating the living room, even though it badly needs it, then you will have certainly learned to do without autonomy and self-actualization. What autonomy is there anywhere without money? Self-actualization is no longer plausible as a need, a goal for anyone. Once again, it becomes a luxury for the rich. This is the context in which I am writing, and maybe too in which you are reading this book. Not that either I or perhaps you are currently unemployed, but both of us are probably limiting our horizons and our purses. And it is easier to become critical of the fad for needs now. It is so obvious that most of them cannot be met. Economic depression has surely made it easier for me, and perhaps for you too, to think critically about the language of needs.